December 16th, 1944, dawned gray and bitterly cold across Belgium's Ardennes forest, where the quiet hills masked a coming storm. Each soldier of the 101st Airborne Division, resting after months of relentless combat, sensed winter's grip tightening around them. The Allied lines stretched thin from the Meuse to Luxembourg, vulnerable to a counterattack few believed Germany could still launch. Yet behind those frost-covered woods, hundreds of German tanks and divisions prepared to strike with desperate ferocity. The plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, aimed to split the Allied front, seize Antwerp, and crush morale before the war's inevitable end. At Bastogne, a small crossroads town of strategic value, the Americans would soon find themselves at the center of Hitler's final gamble. The snow thickened as convoys of weary soldiers rolled through the narrow streets, their breath freezing in the air like drifting ghosts. Civilians shuttered their homes, while church bells tolled faintly beneath the swirling wind. By December 18th, enemy paratroopers and armored spearheads had already shattered forward positions along the northern front. Bastogne became a lifeline, a crossroads linking 7 vital routes through the Ardennes terrain. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding in Major General Maxwell Taylor's absence, organized the defense with hurried precision. Supplies were scarce, fuel was limited, and medical tents overflowed with frostbitten men awaiting morphine that never came. Artillery boomed in the distance, echoing like thunder through the frozen valleys, shaking the stained glass windows of Bastogne's cathedral. Farmers abandoned their fields, herding children into basements as the skies filled with the dull drone of approaching shells. The men of the 501st, 502nd, and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments dug foxholes deep into the icy ground, muttering prayers between clenched jaws. Snow fell endlessly, softening the landscape, yet amplifying every sound of war's advance. Jeeps stalled, radios froze, and rations dwindled into brittle crackers and cold coffee. American sentries watched flickering movements through the mist, unsure whether they faced scouts or shadows. Each night, the temperature plunged below -20, freezing rifles solid and turning breath into crystal dust. In the headquarters at the Heinz barracks, McAuliffe studied maps beneath dim lantern light, his gloved fingers tracing the encircling enemy positions. His officers reported collapsing lines and growing fatigue, yet the general's calm steadied every trembling voice. Outside, a lone Christmas tree stood near the square, its branches heavy with snow, symbolizing fragile hope amid gathering darkness. By the week's end, Bastogne would be surrounded entirely, and history would soon test the resolve of those who refused to surrender. By December 20th, 1944, the town of Bastogne lay completely surrounded, its defenders isolated within a tightening ring of steel and snow. 7 German divisions, supported by tanks of the 5th Panzer Army, closed in from every direction with relentless determination. The once peaceful forests now thundered with artillery barrages that shattered trees like matchsticks and sent splinters slicing through frozen air. Communication with nearby Allied units had been severed, and every road leading out was now under German control.
General Anthony McAuliffe's 101st Airborne Division, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division, prepared for an unyielding siege. Supplies dwindled rapidly, and the men faced the grim prospect of surviving without resupply or reinforcements. The snowdrifts deepened each night, burying vehicles and freezing the rifles that had once been the soldiers' lifelines. Yet morale, though strained, held steady through the quiet strength of leadership and camaraderie forged in earlier campaigns across Normandy and Holland.
Every farmhouse and barn became a makeshift outpost, manned by frostbitten paratroopers scanning the tree line for advancing panzers. Shells landed day and night, shaking the earth beneath their boots and filling the air with smoke and cordite. The wounded were carried on stretchers through knee-deep snow, their moans muffled beneath wool blankets that could not stop the bitter cold. The medics, running low on morphine and bandages, improvised with torn uniforms and whiskey rations. Inside the town, civilians huddled in basements, listening to the constant artillery echo through the narrow streets. Mothers whispered prayers as their children clutched worn dolls, unaware that history unfolded just above their heads. The town's hospital overflowed with casualties, both military and civilian, while the church served as a shelter for those with nowhere left to hide. Outside, American engineers rigged explosives on bridges and crossroads, determined to delay the enemy's inevitable thrust. Despite exhaustion and hunger, the paratroopers of the 101st fought with extraordinary resilience, their training and loyalty binding them together under impossible conditions. Scouts reported that the Germans had issued leaflets promising safe passage for surrendering troops, yet few even glanced at them. McAuliffe's headquarters received constant radio pleas for assistance, though static and interference drowned every faint reply. The men of Bastogne understood now that no help would come soon, and their survival depended solely on their endurance. Beneath the haunting silence of the snowbound forest, an encircled army prepared to defy annihilation, holding a crossroads that would decide the fate of the Western Front. On the morning of December 22, 1944, under a pale and freezing sky, a white flag appeared along Bastogne's western perimeter. Two German officers, escorted by a soldier bearing the flag, advanced cautiously toward the American lines near Kessler's Crossroads. The paratroopers of the 327th Glider Infantry watched silently, their rifles raised, unsure whether this was deception or diplomacy. Moments later, the envoys delivered a sealed letter addressed to the commanding officer of the United States forces in Bastogne. Within its pages lay an ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender within 2 hours. The German message, signed by Lieutenant General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz of the Axis 7 Panzer Corps, warned of total annihilation should resistance continue. It described the overwhelming might surrounding Bastogne, artillery, tanks, and troops prepared to obliterate the encircled division. The envoys spoke of mercy, claiming the Americans would avoid needless bloodshed by capitulating honorably. Their words carried confidence, as if victory was already secured beneath the frozen horizon. The message was relayed to headquarters at the Heinz barracks, where weary officers gathered around a flickering stove, awaiting McAuliffe's decision. General Anthony McAuliffe, wrapped in his wool overcoat and clutching a mug of black coffee, read the typed letter in silence. The room was filled with tense anticipation, every man expecting a lengthy deliberation or a measured diplomatic reply. Instead, the general smiled faintly, muttering a single incredulous word that would soon echo through military history. Nuts. Laughter broke the grim tension as aides confirmed his meaning, realizing that McAuliffe's brief response captured the essence of American defiance. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th was chosen to deliver the official reply to the waiting German officers. When asked for clarification, Harper explained that nuts meant the Americans refused to surrender, regardless of circumstance. The Germans, bewildered by the slang, sought translation, yet none could fully convey the mixture of contempt, courage, and humor embedded within that single syllable. Harper saluted curtly, turned on his heel, and walked back through the snow, leaving the stunned envoys standing beneath the gray Ardennes sky. Inside Bastogne, word of McAuliffe's reply spread rapidly among the troops, lifting spirits that had waned under siege. Frozen soldiers laughed through chattering teeth, their morale renewed by the audacity of their commander's refusal. Amid hunger, exhaustion, and ceaseless bombardment, that one word became their rallying cry. Bastogne would not surrender. Against impossible odds, the defenders prepared to fight on, embodying resilience that would forever define their legacy. In the dim interior of Bastogne's Heinz barracks, the air smelled of cold coffee, tobacco, and the distant thud of artillery fire. General Anthony McAuliffe sat surrounded by exhausted officers, their faces illuminated by a single lantern swaying above a cluttered map table. The German ultimatum had arrived with its threat of annihilation, yet within minutes, its authority was dismantled by one spontaneous, unfiltered word. McAuliffe's nuts was not a planned statement of defiance, but a genuine reaction of disbelief, dismissing surrender as an absurd impossibility. Colonel Harry Kinnard, Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore, and the staff present recognized instantly that this unintentional remark carried extraordinary weight. It perfectly encapsulated the stubborn humor and spirit of the American fighting man, irreverent in the face of overwhelming odds. When Kennard suggested that nuts should serve as the official written reply, McAuliffe agreed, signing the brief note on standard stationery and handing it to Colonel Joseph Harper for delivery. Outside, snow continued falling in thick, wind-driven sheets, muting the sound of explosions beyond the town's edge. Harper, escorted by a small detail of paratroopers, trudged through waist-deep snow to meet the German delegation at the front line. The enemy officers, formal and confident, awaited the expected surrender terms, unaware they were about to receive one of history's shortest military responses. Harper handed them the paper with a firm salute. One officer read the message aloud, confusion spreading across his face as he stammered, "Was bedeutet das? Nuts?" Harper smiled coldly and replied, "In plain English it means, go to hell." His words pierced the icy silence like a rifle shot before he turned and marched back toward the American lines. Inside Bastogne, laughter rippled through the ranks as the message spread from foxhole to command post. Men repeated the word proudly, carving it into wooden crates and painting it on frozen helmets. It became more than defiance. It became identity, proof that morale and humor could survive even under siege. The phrase crossed every boundary of rank, uniting generals and privates beneath a single expression of contempt for surrender. For the German command, the answer was incomprehensible arrogance. For the Americans, it became legend before the day ended. Amid shellfire, snow, and starvation, the defenders of Bastogne found something greater than courage, an unshakable conviction forged in humor. McAuliffe's single word transformed despair into defiance, ensuring that Bastogne's stand would echo far beyond the frozen Ardennes. By December 23, 1944, the siege of Bastogne had reached its brutal crescendo, as German artillery thundered ceaselessly across the snow-blanketed landscape. Every crossroads, farmhouse, and hedgerow became a contested frontier where exhausted men fought inch by inch against encirclement. The 101st Airborne, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, clung to their defensive perimeter with grim determination. Foxholes filled with freezing water, rifles jammed from ice, and medical stations overflowed with men wrapped in blood-stained blankets. Yet the resolve within those trenches refused to yield beneath the storm's weight. At Foy, Noville, and Marvy, German tanks advanced through thick fog, their treads grinding the frozen earth into iron dust. Bazooka teams waited in silence until the panzers loomed close enough to strike, the explosions lighting the night like fleeting suns. Each successful hit was celebrated not with cheers, but with weary relief, for every victory merely delayed another wave. Radio operators reported that Patton's Third Army was moving north, yet the distance and weather rendered rescue uncertain. Meanwhile, ammunition dwindled, forcing gunners to ration shells while infantrymen reused captured German weapons. The paratroopers' endurance relied as much on camaraderie as on tactics. Men shared their last cigarettes and pieces of frozen chocolate, whispering jokes that masked their fear. In the foxholes, frostbitten hands loaded rifles with trembling precision, while medics trudged through snowdrifts to retrieve the wounded. Mortar fire shattered walls and splintered trees, scattering debris across a town already stripped of warmth. Still, the defenders held each approach with calculated discipline, guided by officers who refused to entertain retreat. McAuliffe's calm voice over the radio reminded them that Bastogne was the hole in the donut, and the hole would not break. Within the town, civilians aided where they could, bringing hot broth to soldiers between bombardments. Children carried messages beneath the shellfire, their bravery etched forever into the memories of hardened men. Bastogne's streets resembled a frozen labyrinth of smoke, blood, and resilience. Every corner told a story of defiance written in gunfire and snow. The sound of church bells occasionally cut through the chaos, marking the hours of an unending battle fought against hunger, exhaustion, and despair. By nightfall, the storm intensified, blanketing corpses and craters beneath layers of merciful snow. The defenders slept beside their rifles, knowing dawn would bring another assault. The crossroads still stood, unbroken and defiant, guarded by paratroopers who refused surrender. Against overwhelming odds, Bastogne endured as the white inferno raged without mercy across the Ardennes. Beneath the echo of artillery and the endless snowfall, Bastogne's civilians endured a nightmare that blurred the lines between survival and despair. Families crowded into damp cellars beneath shattered homes, their trembling hands clutching candles that flickered in rhythm with distant explosions. The once bustling market town, famed for its quiet cobblestone streets and ancient church bells, had transformed into a frozen tomb. Each thundering barrage sent dust cascading from ceilings, while the air reeked of smoke, sweat, and damp earth. The townspeople, stripped of comfort and warmth, faced a siege that cared nothing for innocence or neutrality. Children huddled close to their mothers, listening to the muffled battle raging above, unaware that history was being carved overhead. Food vanished quickly, replaced by thin broth made from snow and potato peelings. The town's priest, Father Jacques, moved silently between shelters, offering blessings amid chaos, whispering prayers that mingled with the moans of the wounded. His church, Saint Pierre, became a sanctuary and field hospital, its pews covered with blankets and the wounded lying beneath the faint glow of candlelight. Each hour, stretcher-bearers carried in soldiers and civilians alike, their faces pale from shock or frostbite. The 101st Airborne medics, led by Captain Jack Pryor and others, worked tirelessly with what little they possessed. Morphine ran out within days, bandages were torn from curtains, and surgical tools were sterilized over open flames. Civilians volunteered to fetch snow for water, risking sniper fire that cut across the square. The courage of Bastogne's residents became the silent counterpart to the soldiers' defiance, their endurance forming the siege's moral backbone. Amid suffering, small gestures, sharing a crust of bread or lighting a single candle, became acts of rebellion against despair itself. Outside, the temperature plunged again, freezing corpses where they fell and encasing streets in sheets of treacherous ice. Entire families emerged briefly during lulls in shelling to bury loved ones in shallow graves near the churchyard. Even the dead seemed suspended in time, preserved beneath layers of snow until the thaw of liberation. Despite hunger, grief, and exhaustion, the townspeople never abandoned the soldiers who fought for their survival. They offered shelter, maps, and courage, becoming unwritten heroes within the siege's frozen saga. By Christmas Eve, the sky glowed orange from distant fires, casting eerie light upon the shattered rooftops. Within every cellar, prayers rose in whispered harmony, blending faith with fear beneath the thunder of artillery. Bastogne's civilians, caught helplessly between two armies, remained its frozen heartbeat, fragile yet unbroken, sustaining the soul of a town refusing to die. For nearly a week, Bastogne's defenders fought beneath a sky sealed by fog, where salvation hovered unseen beyond the heavy clouds. The men of the 101st Airborne stared upward daily, praying for the drone of friendly engines that never came. The weather, cruel, unrelenting, and freezing, had grounded Allied air support since the siege began, leaving the surrounded garrison cut off from food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Each passing hour deepened the hunger and despair that crept through the foxholes like an invisible enemy. Frostbite blackened fingers, bandages froze solid, and ammunition dwindled to the final rounds. General McAuliffe's headquarters sent desperate radio transmissions requesting airdrops, though most signals vanished into static carried by the wind. The skies remained closed, an opaque curtain separating life from death. Men stripped ammunition from fallen comrades and rationed bread so thinly that crumbs became luxuries. The fog, dense as smoke, silenced even the hope of rescue, muffling the distant rumble of engines that teased and disappeared. In those grey days, time slowed, and the soldiers of Bastogne learned the purest form of waiting, between endurance and extinction. Then, on December 23rd, the miracle arrived with the morning sun. The clouds lifted suddenly, revealing a clear blue expanse stretching above the battered town. Within hours, the sound of engines echoed from the south, and hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft appeared in formation. Their silver wings glinted against the winter light, releasing parachutes that bloomed like flowers across the white horizon. Ammunition, medical kits, and rations descended slowly, swaying beneath colorful silk canopies, landing across the snowy fields surrounding Bastogne. Men cheered through tears, waving helmets and signal panels as supplies drifted down like gifts from heaven. Yet the drop zones were perilous, covered by sniper fire and artillery bursts. Paratroopers sprinted through open ground to collect crates, while shells erupted around them, tearing snow and shrapnel into the air. Medics retrieved medical pouches as bullets hissed past their heads, and quartermasters stacked crates behind burned-out vehicles. Among the recovered supplies were precious blood plasma, batteries, radio equipment, and the cigarettes that soldiers would later call the best they ever smoked. For the first time since encirclement, hope returned in tangible form. The airlift continued for days, the thundering aircraft overhead symbolizing endurance reclaimed from despair. Beneath that reborn sky, morale soared higher than the drifting parachutes. Bastogne, once starved and forgotten, breathed again through the mercy of air and courage. The siege would continue, but now, the defenders knew they were no longer alone beneath the winter heavens. Far to the south of Bastogne, while snow buried the forests and roads of the Ardennes, General George S. Patton was already moving. His Third Army, redirected with impossible speed, had pivoted north in one of the most daring maneuvers of the entire European campaign. Through blizzards, frozen rivers, and enemy ambushes, 3 divisions advanced toward the encircled 101st Airborne. Every mile of that march became a testament to coordination, endurance, and Patton's relentless willpower. His men drove tanks through drifts taller than the vehicles themselves, repaired engines in sub-zero darkness, and pressed onward without sleep. By December 24th, reconnaissance reports confirmed Bastogne's dire situation. Ammunition nearly exhausted, medical supplies scarce, and casualties mounting by the hour. Patton ordered the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey to spearhead the relief. The men advanced toward the town of Neufchâteau, then north through rolling terrain that had become a frozen wasteland of mines, wreckage, and ambush points. German resistance was fierce, with anti-tank guns hidden behind every ridge and sniper fire harassing columns from forest edges. Yet the Americans pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that time was life. Within Bastogne, McAuliffe's paratroopers held their perimeter with dwindling strength. They heard faint artillery from the south and guessed that Patton was coming. Every man clung to that sound like a promise. The fog thickened again on Christmas morning, but the shelling from the outer ring suggested the tide was turning. Soldiers whispered prayers beside foxholes, listening as the distant engines of armored vehicles grew louder through the snow. The siege had lasted 6 harrowing days, yet their defiance had bought the hours Patton required to reach them. On December 26, 1944, at approximately 4:50 p.m., elements of the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams broke through at Mont de Saint-Étienne. The first Sherman tank rolled into Bastogne, greeted by cheering paratroopers who emerged from trenches waving rifles and tattered flags. The link-up marked the symbolic end of the siege, though fighting continued along the outer ring for several days. Men wept openly, their frost-bitten hands gripping the armor of Patton's tanks as though touching deliverance itself. That night, Bastogne's defenders shared rations and stories beside burning wreckage, their exhaustion swallowed by relief. Patton's march, executed with precision under the cruelest winter in European memory, became legend. Against all calculation, Bastogne had held long enough for salvation to arrive, ensuring that one defiant word, nuts, would forever stand unbroken in military history. When the guns finally fell silent around Bastogne, the snow concealed a battlefield soaked in blood, sacrifice, and silent endurance. Between December 19th and December 27th, 1944, over 2,500 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing, while German losses surpassed 15,000. The forests of the Ardennes, once serene, had become graveyards of frozen bodies and shattered machines. The survivors, numb from exhaustion, moved among wrecks and craters, searching for comrades who would never answer again. Courage had preserved Bastogne, but it demanded a price that scarred every man who lived through the siege. Medics worked without rest, transforming barns into makeshift hospitals, where the wounded lay in rows beneath flickering lanterns. The moans of men echoed through the cold night, joined by the distant toll of church bells mourning the fallen. Frostbite claimed limbs as surely as bullets, and doctors performed amputations with saws sterilized over open flames. Among the soldiers, grief was private and wordless, expressed in quiet gestures: a shared cigarette, a blanket placed over the dead, a silent salute toward the trees. In the face of unbearable loss, the brotherhood born at Bastogne deepened into something sacred and unspoken. For the civilians who survived, the aftermath carried its own torment. Homes stood in ruins, livestock perished, and streets were littered with twisted metal and abandoned helmets. Families searched for missing relatives as Allied engineers cleared mines from the frozen roads. The people of Bastogne, though broken and hungry, offered bread and wine to the soldiers who had defended them. Children followed paratroopers through the wreckage, clinging to them as symbols of deliverance. In that mingling of gratitude and grief, the line between liberator and survivor blurred into shared humanity. As reports spread across Europe, Bastogne became a symbol of endurance under impossible odds. Correspondents from Stars and Stripes and Time magazine immortalized McAuliffe's "nuts" reply, transforming a spontaneous remark into legend. For the men of the 101st, however, glory felt distant beside the memories of friends buried beneath the snow. They remembered names whispered during night watches, faces lost in smoke, and laughter silenced forever. When Patton visited the town days later, he saluted the defenders with uncharacteristic solemnity, acknowledging courage beyond command. Bastogne stood in ruins, yet its spirit remained unbroken, a monument carved not from stone, but from endurance, pain, and loyalty. The siege had ended, but its echoes, of valor, loss, and brotherhood, would endure long after the snow melted from the Ardennes fields. Decades after the guns fell silent over Bastogne, the siege remained a defining chapter in the annals of military history, immortalized by a single word: nuts. General Anthony McAuliffe's spontaneous reply to the German ultimatum transcended its humorous origins, becoming a symbol of unwavering defiance under impossible circumstances. Soldiers, historians, and civilians alike have cited that moment as a testament to human courage, demonstrating how leadership, morale, and a shared sense of purpose can alter the course of events against overwhelming odds. The 101st Airborne Division, later celebrated as the Screaming Eagles, carried the legacy of Bastogne into countless subsequent conflicts. Their stand inspired future generations of soldiers to value tenacity, humor, and decisiveness under pressure. Military academies around the world have analyzed the Ardennes siege, emphasizing McAuliffe's combination of audacity and clarity as an example of leadership in crisis. It showed that defiance, when paired with disciplined execution and strategic awareness, could transform a desperate defensive position into a triumph of the human spirit. For the civilians of Bastogne, the memory of those days has become a cornerstone of local identity. Streets once littered with shells and snow now display plaques commemorating the bravery of paratroopers and townspeople alike. Every year, wreaths are laid at the War Memorial, and veterans return to walk the streets they defended together, sharing stories with children who may never see another war. The courage displayed amidst snow, starvation, and constant bombardment continues to shape Bastogne's communal memory, binding generations through the story of survival and solidarity. The moral of Bastogne resonates far beyond military doctrine. It illustrates the impact of decisiveness in leadership, the power of morale in sustaining human effort, and the significance of small acts of humor and courage in the darkest hours. McAuliffe's one-word reply reminds humanity that even amidst encirclement, freezing temperatures, and overwhelming opposition, dignity and resolve can endure. It transformed what could have been a narrative of surrender into a timeless story of inspiration, showing that sometimes words, no matter how brief, can embody defiance more powerfully than armies themselves. Ultimately, Bastogne stands as a testament to human endurance, bravery, and the enduring impact of a single courageous choice. The siege, the suffering, and the triumph continue to remind the world that history is shaped not only by strategies and numbers, but by the spirit of those who refuse to yield. The echoes of nuts remain etched in memory, immortalizing a crossroads in the Ardennes where courage and defiance defined the destiny of men, town, and nation alike.